Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you guys so much for coming. Happy Whitman Day. So to our university leaders, our students, our staff, our faculty, our friends, we're delighted to have you here at the Whitman School of Management to celebrate Whitman Day. Whitman Day brings together our community to reflect on how Whitman has positively impacted our lives and how to appreciate all the ways we are preparing students to make the world a better place. And I think this upcoming conversation will be a great example of that. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, fire keepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous people on whose ancestral lands Syracuse University now stands. I have the privilege of introducing someone who probably doesn't need much in terms of an introduction in this room, especially given all the media he's received in the last few weeks. Nevertheless, I'm going to take the moment because he deserves it, and also I know how much it embarrasses him. So Mike Haynie came to Syracuse University almost 2 decades ago as a faculty member teaching entrepreneurship. What he did next defines him. He didn't just teach entrepreneurship, he practiced it. Inside our university, he built the Daniello Institute for Veterans and Military Families from the ground up. That is the nation's first interdisciplinary academic institute of its kind. And in doing so, he made Syracuse one of the premier destinations in American higher ed for veterans and military-connected students and their families. The IVMF has now trained hundreds of thousands of military veterans, creating a generation of entrepreneurs and business leaders. He took on this task despite being told that this is not what he should be doing as a tenure track faculty member. But in true Mike fashion, he didn't listen. His impactful work brought him to national attention. He was featured on 60 Minutes. Time magazine named him one of 16 individuals working toward a more equal America. He has advised the White House, chaired federal advisory committees, been asked to speak to Congress, and shaped national policy on behalf of those who have served. In 2018, he was named University Professor, the highest academic distinction Syracuse University offers. In 2021, he received the Chancellor's Medal for leading the university through COVID-19. And during all of that, he still taught and researched entrepreneurship, making sure to maintain his connections to our students, those connections as students at Whitman and through the many military entrepreneurship programs we offer. His scholarly work, and people forget he is also a professor, appears in the top journals globally and has been cited approximately 9,000 times. 9,000 times makes him one of the most influential entrepreneurship scholars in the world. He's also received global teaching awards, including from the Academy of Management, the premier industry association for faculty. I know, I don't get to do this very often, Mike, so I'll do this one, I'll wrap it up. But I will say this. His commitment to scholarship and our students has been pervasive throughout his time at Whitman and Syracuse University. It's important to note that at a time where many senior administrators drift away from their intellectual identity, he hasn't. And his research helping to understand how and why people adapt when facing conditions of uncertainty is certainly appropriate given his new role. For those of you who have not seen the light for the last couple of weeks, you should know that Mike Haynie, as of last week, is now the acting chancellor of Syracuse University. He's a builder, a scholar, an advocate for veterans, and a leader who has poured his heart, soul, and career into this place and our community for almost 20 years. Please join me in welcoming Acting Chancellor Mike Haynie. Leading the discussion today with Acting Chancellor Haynie.
I want his intro to be as long as mine just was.
That's one of the downsides. I've known Marc for a while, but not for 20 years. So interviewing Mike today is Marc Pantano, a Whitman class of 2026 grad, a Remembrance Scholar, a member of Syracuse University Choir. Marc, over to you.
Cool.
So, before you ask me a question,
Yeah.
how did we meet?
So we met at a remembrance dinner that happened the first day of Remembrance Week, and we just happened to be at the same table. And immediately he started talking to me, introducing himself, getting to know me because he's also very familiar with Whitman. And we started talking about the creator economy, talked about remembrance, and then after that, I was like, now that you've met me, you're gonna just start seeing me around on the streets. And it's true. I saw him on Marshall Street. We walked past each other a bunch. And then afterwards, we met again. And
There's I wanted to tell that story because there's a lesson. I think it's in some of your questions, but for students, show up. Show up. That's all you did was show up, right? And look at you now. Showing up, yeah. And by the way, before you have to show everybody your socks.
Yeah,
where it starts. That's Whitman socks. That's what we teach in the business school. It's called marketing, brand building.
Yep. Orange tie, pin.
Okay, now I could get back to what you're here to do.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you all so much for joining us for Whitman Day. We have an incredible morning ahead, and I can't think of a better way to kick it off than with a conversation with someone who spent almost 2 decades here, pouring himself into the university and the community, Mike Haynie. So first question, you've been here for about 20 years at Whitman and at Syracuse, and before we get into your story, I wanted to ask you something that feels right for Whitman Day. What makes this community different? What has kept you here, and what do you think sets Whitman apart at a time when every business school is looking for ways to stand out?
It's a good question. You know, truth be told, and I can say this now, I don't. You know, some of the folks that hired me are in this room, Clint, back for a visit. When I took this job, I actually did not have an intention of staying here 20 years. You know, I was getting out of the military at the time. I had been teaching at the Air Force Academy. And, you know, I really was looking for an opportunity to plant myself in civilian higher education, you know, figure out the landscape, but was probably thinking that I'd do a couple of years here and then, and that's how I had been conditioned. I was in the military for 14 years. I moved 9 times in 14 years. So my brain was sort of wired. You stay at a place, a couple of years, but you know, Whitman was a place that from the very beginning of my experience here was always willing to say yes, and I don't know that that's not so elegant in terms of an explanation, but what I mean by that is, you know, I had things I wanted to do, and things that were important to me, and the leadership, the culture here was, yeah, sure, go give it a shot. And I think I appreciated that uniquely. You know, but there's another piece of it too. You know, we're here for Whitman Day, and you know, part of what Whitman Day is about is recognizing the legacy of Marty Whitman, who gave this school its name. And, you know, I remember it is true what Alex, so I'm going to sound like a hypocrite because what Alex said about my veterans work, there were some folks who came to me and said, hey, this is not what you're supposed to be doing as a tenure track faculty member. And not only maybe should I not have been doing it, I didn't know what I was doing either. Meaning that, you know, I'd never built a program before. I'd certainly never raised money before. And, you know, we had this idea early on in my time here, about 6 months in, to launch a program to bring traumatically wounded service members to the university over the summer and help them become small business owners. And I figured, you know, for me, it was, you know, here I am, an entrepreneurship professor. I'm a veteran myself. It's something I could do. But one of my conditions, and it's funny to think about in retrospect, a new assistant professor has been here for 6 months imposing conditions on the business school. But I wanted this program to be free because I just, meaning I wanted us to go raise the money as an institution to make, because the idea of bringing that community of folks here, but then charging them for it just didn't feel right to me. And, Mel Stith, who was the dean at the time, said, sure, we'll make it free, go raise the money. Well, I didn't know how to raise money. And I was miserable at it, absolutely miserable. And 2 months before the program was set to start, I needed to raise like $120,000. 2 months before the program was set to start, I think I raised about $20,000. But yet all these people were coming, and that was the first time I actually met Marty Whitman. And if you know anything about Marty's story, he was a veteran, served in World War II, and when he got out and tried to go to school, he applied to all of these Ivy League schools. Everybody told him no, and Syracuse gave him a different answer. And so he heard about what we were trying to do, and he wrote one check, as he could, and covered the delta for that initial program. But he made a point. This is a long way to get your answer. He made a point to me that has stuck with me now for 20 years about this community, and not just Whitman, but Syracuse University, that this is an institution that gives people a chance when others would not. And I think as I look at the role that I step into now, I often tell entrepreneurship students when I teach that one of the things that truly good entrepreneurs understand, good business leaders understand, is what is open for change and what should never change. And as we think about all of the change that has happened, that will happen in the future for this institution, for me, that lesson from Mr. Whitman, is right in the front of my brain all the time. We certainly can't shrink away from the change that's required for us to thrive into the future. But there are things about this place that should never change. I think one of those things that should never change is being an institution that's willing to give people a chance.
Oh, I think that's great. I agree that, and I think with your leadership too, that'll only be increased in the future.
Look at him
Thank you.
sucking up already. You're like
Good one. As students studying entrepreneurship and business, we talk a lot about building something from nothing, which you've kind of mentioned in your previous answer. And you did that with the major research university that you founded with the Daniello Institute for Veterans and Military Families. What does it really take to build something new inside of a large established institution? So maybe the process of doing.
Yeah, it's an interesting experience. I thought my experience working in the federal government, there was a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of road. Try higher ed. There's a lot of people that want a voice in everything you do, which is fine. But there is also there is a real pull at a place like this or any other longstanding academic institution, pull to the status quo. And I think and a lot of I would be willing to bet a lot of folks in the face of that just stop trying. And that's unfortunate because some of the best, most impactful things throughout the history of this institution were things that maybe at first blush don't fit, right? Or don't belong, or that are so outside the norm. But now, today, they are the norm. They are what we do. And, I think for me, there is an advantage of not knowing any better. In other words, being naive. I didn't know that. I'll give you a different example of a few years into my time here. This first veterans program, that our entrepreneurship bootcamp for veterans had sort of taken off and blown up, and 60 Minutes comes and does a story, and other universities reach out and want to be part of the program. And that part of that was the other thing that happened is I started receiving, I didn't know much about SU's history related to veterans that goes back to World War II. Most of you probably don't know that history either. But, the reality is we wouldn't be the institution we are today if it weren't for some choices made by Chancellor Tully right after World War II. We were actually a small regional college that did not have an enrollment more than about 4,200 students through much of our history up to World War II. And Chancellor Tully was a friend of President Roosevelt. And Roosevelt asked Chancellor Tully to be part of this group he was putting together to figure out what to do with 12.5 million returning World War II veterans. And that was the group that came up with the original GI Bill. And Tully, if you read his memoir, very strategically, he saw that cohort, those returning World War II vets and that GI Bill as a way to actually transform Syracuse University from really a regional college to a nationally relevant research institution. So he wrote a letter that we have over in the National Veterans Research Center. He wrote a letter in 1944 inviting any returning World War II veteran that wanted to earn a college degree admission to Syracuse University. And we went from 1944-45 an enrollment of about 4,100 students to within a few years close to 18,000 students. And that entire delta were returning World War II veterans. I didn't know that history when I came here. I learned that history because I started getting letters from those folks shortly after we launched some of those first veterans programs here. And these are individuals in their 70s and 80s at this point, telling me their stories. And for me, that was another light bulb moment. One of the other things we love to do in higher education is start institutes and centers for everything. You look around, you pick an obscure topic somewhere in U.S. higher ed, there's a center for it. But I was really surprised. I started looking around. There was no center in U.S. higher ed focused on the social, economic, wellness concerns of veterans and their families. And it's such a big economic issue, it's a social issue, it's a cultural, and that was surprising to me that those issues weren't being studied in higher ed. It wasn't a focus. So that was the genesis for the idea of creating the Institute for Veterans and Military Families here. But this is another long way to get to here. Like a good former military officer, I put a plan together with 45 PowerPoint slides. And I got a meeting with the chancellor of the university at the time. And her response to me was, "That's a good idea, but who's going to pay for it?" And I didn't appreciate that at the time. Much more now, I appreciate that that response. But I didn't know that was supposed to be the end of the conversation, because I didn't know how all of this worked. Right. This is my point of there's an advantage to being naive sometimes. So we had a program. So I figured, okay, maybe that was her telling me that, giving me a conditional yes if I went out and found the money for this. And I didn't. We had a program at the time with JP Morgan Chase over in RI school, nothing to do with veterans. It had to do with some cybersecurity things that we were doing with JP Morgan. And I found out who ran that program and talked my way. I got 10 minutes down in Manhattan with the global chief operating officer at JP Morgan, a guy named Frank Bisignano, who some Whitman students have met because I had this gets way ahead of my story, but Frank was one of our impact speakers last year. At the time, all the banks were in some public trouble related to the veterans community because there were things going on in the mortgage business that were not ideal, let's just say. And again, there's a wedge, and I played that wedge, and so I went in to Frank and I essentially said, I have an opportunity for you all to repent a little bit. I want to start this institute and I need some money. And he said, how much do you need? And my only regret from this meeting, what I'm about to say, is I should have asked for more money. But I didn't ask for a little. I said, I need $7.5 million. And he said, done. And that was but then I had to come back here and tell people, hey, I just got $7.5 million. We have to start this institute. And, but the point of the story is, I think they're, back to this idea of the status quo culture might have been, okay, you got your answer from the chancellor. There's no money to do this. Stop. But I wasn't really part of that culture yet. And so figure it out. And that's, I think as we look at what's ahead for higher education, we're operating in an environment right now that is more disrupted. For 80 years, higher ed nothing changed. It was exactly the same. Every year, do the same thing. Essentially serve the same population of students. Last 5 years, everything that we thought we understood about how this entity, this sector operates has been thrown out the window. And if we don't maybe bring some naive thinking and challenge some of the assumptions that we've had for a long, long time, things could go bad very quickly for us. Just put it that way.
Cool. I have a quick follow-up question. How did you develop the mindset where you kind of continue to fight for the things that you believe in?
Yeah, that's a good question. I also think there's a little here's how I answer it. If not if now, yeah. If I were to stand up here and read to you some of the emails I've received from some of my college friends in the past month about the fact that I'm doing what I'm doing right now. Listen, I was not. College was a struggle for me I was not a great student in high school because I didn't care that much about being a great student. And, I had a couple experiences as an undergrad that made me rethink caring about things like this. But the reality is, I think I've always had a little bit of a chip on my shoulder, and that chip can be valuable sometimes. When I believe in something, I don't like to hear somebody tell me no. Yeah. And I with respect and care, I try to find a way to turn no into yes.
Great, thank you. So your work on behalf of veterans earned you a national platform, appearing on 60 Minutes, Time Magazine, and the White House advisory roles. What responsibility comes with that kind of visibility, and how do you stay grounded in the mission when the platform is starting to grow?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the responsibility piece should be easy to answer, right? Particularly if the work you're doing is something you believe in, and that you value. If you're going to put yourself in a position as a leader in any community, that comes with a responsibility to be authentic about your work and, to take every opportunity to advance the cause, the narrative. The grounded thing is different because when 60 Minutes shows up out of the blue and says, hey, we want to do it. And by the way, that whole 60 Minutes piece was shot in this building. 60 Minutes came up here for almost a month and followed some of the work we were doing. And that was a unique experience in and of itself. But you can imagine after a 60 Minutes feature story. Lots of other things pop up, and I realized with the help of a friend, very close friend who's I served with in the Air Force, and some folks in this room know him, but he got out the same time I did. I came to Syracuse. He went to Florida State. We had both been teaching at the Air Force Academy, and I there were all of these things after the 60 Minutes piece that oh, will you come do this and be part of this, and as only a close friend can. He sort of had one of those conversations with me to knock me down a peg or two, and it was super helpful. And to this day, and I've told this story before. This isn't new. To this day, I have a piece of paper that's 16, 17 years old in my wallet, a folded up little piece of paper, and I wrote just for myself, and I'm not going to show you. I'm not going to share it, but I wrote on that piece of paper a sentence about why I was doing that work, as a way to sort of remind myself when the opportunity to be seduced away by these shiny things may present it, and I can feel it. It's folded in a little square. I can feel it in my wallet when I sit down, and I've carried that thing around for, it's probably been 17 years now, 16, 17 years. Because I think it's important. I use the word authentic as part of, my respect. It's important that if you're going to put yourself out in front of a cause, particularly a social cause, that you do it in a way that is never about you, that's about the work and the people that you're serving. But that you can see example after example in popular culture of where people forget that.
Right. Oh, great answer. And I think that,
Thanks, Mark.
yeah, of course. Maybe in the future there will be a Whitman event where we do that activity and
Oh yeah.
hold a piece
There you go.
in your wallet.
Mhm.
I think that's really good. You spent 14 years as an officer in the United States Air Force before transitioning into academia and eventually to senior university leadership. How did your military experience shape the way you lead?
Yeah. Another good question. The Air Force, I have to be honest, I was a college kid. One, I had to figure out a way to pay for college. And I went to did my undergrad at the University of Delaware. But I was able to go. My parents were first generation college students. Mom taught fourth grade in a public school. It wasn't a lot of money is the point. And the military became an ROTC scholarship became the way that I could afford college. But I was a child of the Top Gun movie, the first one, and I wanted to fly. I mean, I really wanted to fly. And the 6 months before I was to graduate, get commissioned, I failed a physical. I felt my eyesight was no longer qualifying me to fly, and I ended up but I still owed the Air Force because they had paid for me to go to college. So I ended up having to go do something else, and I thought it was the end of the world. And it turns out it was wonderful. I grew up in Philadelphia. The Air Force decided to assign me to an Air Force base in Idaho. I didn't know where Idaho was. And this was the days where you had to pull out an atlas, like a paper atlas, to look at a map. I had no idea. I thought I was being sent to another country. And I got out there and I loved it. And it was a great experience. The opportunity as a 22-year-old to lead people twice my age, and then okay, but I was still going to get out. And then the next assignment comes, and it's another really interesting opportunity. And then the next one comes, and it's another. And where I'm going with this is one of the things that I took away from my military experience that, I hold very close in the context of what I've done out of the military is this willingness to say yes. I think, and I'm not suggesting you say yes to everything, but you're open to. I'm not a big believer anymore in the 5-year plan. Like, I think when I talk to students sometimes, I'm shocked when I'm talking to a 20-year-old who has the next 10 years of their life mapped out and the jobs they're going to do and how it's going to progress. I think when you do that, you close the door, the cognitive door, to all of these other opportunities. You'll never see them. They'll be right there in front of you. These other doors you can walk through, and because you're so focused on this plan, you won't see all of these wonderful, opportunities. And, what I learned from my time in the military is, you never know what life's going to tee up next. And you should be willing and open to at least explore a possibility that wasn't part of that plan that you had set out for yourself. And it's sort of how, I've, if you haven't noticed over the last 10 years or so of my time here, I've had a lot of different jobs. I joke with, some of my colleagues that, I was the vice chancellor for things that didn't fit places or didn't work somewhere else, or, and that was fun for me, because, but I took the willingness to be that person was something that was really born as a consequence of my experience in the military.
Yeah. When you were leading in the military, the people that were older than your age, what was it like trying to earn their respect and kind of listen to what you were telling them?
So one of the things that, so that's a very good question, Mark. Thanks. Yeah, sure. I think one of the things that, and Frank Pizziano, back to, he mentioned this when he was out here as well. There's a real shortage of people who just do things. Like, it doesn't matter, again, sometimes when I talk to some of our students, they're very focused on, the right title in the right company. And, the reality is, what leaders need most, around them when, they are running complex organizations, is people that they can count on just to get stuff done. Like, executing is an underappreciated skill. And, it not only, because I will tell you, I collect those people. Like, throughout my professional life, if I find somebody, who, without drama, without having to watch over their shoulder, and it doesn't matter how big, you hear people say, oh, CEOs don't focus on the details. That's BS. they but the reason that people say that is because those CEOs have really good people around them who make those details non-issues, right? Who just go out, and it doesn't matter if it's making sure the flowers are right on the table, or the, copies are made for a meeting. My advice is be that person that goes out there and just gets stuff done for whatever organ. But, that's also, though, how you earn respect of people who've been around and part of an organization for a long time, that may be older than you, that may have more experience. Just be the person that comes in and makes problems go away without anybody having to supervise you. And that was really my, that was my approach as a young lieutenant. Even though technically I was the person in charge. I mean, I had, 50-year-old folks working for me at 20, and I was 22. But my strategy to earn their respect was to be there right next to them, doing whatever I was asking them to do. I was going to be part of that doing as well.
Thank you. I think that's good for the students to hear for sure. My next question. In 2021, you received the Chancellor's Medal for learning the university's response to COVID-19. And for those of us who were students during that period, it was one of the most disorienting times that we had to go through. But what did leading through that kind of uncertainty teach you that you couldn't have learned in any other way?
So I'll say I can only talk about this now, because at the time, none of it was, I've told people all my time in the military, there was probably nothing more emotionally draining and traumatic that I experienced in the military. COVID was worse, because we were a university. For those students who were not here, we were a university, and great credit to Chancellor Severud. We made the decision in March of 2020 during spring break not to bring students back, but to finish the last 3-4 weeks of the semester online. But 2 weeks after we made that decision, we made the decision that we will open this university in August of 2020 for residential life, residential students. Think about that. We're a month and a half into a pandemic. We know nothing. The country knows nothing. But we made the decision that we're going to open, and the only reason the university did open and bring all of our students back and all our new freshmen was because we made that decision in April of 2020. If we would have waited till July, like a lot of other schools did, never would have opened. Like a lot of other schools. I mean, we were one of the few universities, peer institutions in all of New York State, I think, that actually opened residentially. That said, it was really, really hard. We have no medical school here. So under New York State rules, we had to figure out how to test 4,000 people a week on this campus. We turned the dome into a testing center. We raided biology labs to find PCR machines that were being used for research that we could repurpose and use them to do COVID testing. Like, we set up our own laboratories, but it was, to your question, it was such a learning experience for me. I'm a business, I got put in charge of COVID. I'm an entrepreneurship professor. What do I know? Nothing is the answer. I'm not a public health professional. I'm not an epidemiologist, but 2 days after Chancellor Severud asked me to assume that leadership role, I spent like 3 hours scouring the SU website, the faculty website, to find anybody on our faculty who knows anything, anybody with epidemiology in their bio, the whole public health department. And I sent them all an email. So there's probably 25, 30 folks that I found. I sent them all an email, and I said, listen, I've been asked to lead this thing. I don't know what this thing is. But if you're willing to show up tomorrow at 2:00 in a conference room and treat me like I'm a fourth grader and tell me what you think we need to know as an institution to navigate this. And about 15 folks showed up, and those 15 folks became the core advisory group, if you will, for the next 2.5 years. But that was a lesson for me, right? One of the great things about universities is the intellectual capital that resides on this campus. We don't think often enough to leverage it, to help us solve problems and think through tough decisions. The other big lesson for me was about communication. Again, if you were here then, so we finally open the doors. We bring 4,000 freshmen and all our other students back, and we were the only university around that was open. Governor was not happy. We were open, made that very clear to us. And we weren't here 2 weeks. We weren't open for 2 weeks. And our freshmen, bless their hearts, decided to organize a flash mob. They used WhatsApp, and they organized a flash mob up on the quad. And I had gone, they did it like 11 o'clock at night. And I had gone home. I was exhausted and I woke up and I had like 20 missed calls, and I must have slept through my phone. And, and I call one person back, like, what is going on? And the answer was turn on CNN. And there we were on and it was a national news story. And I was furious. And I came in the next day, and our one of my good colleagues, who was our chief communications person, he and his team had written a little message they wanted me to send to campus. And it's how do I say this in a way that's not, it sounded like it had been written by like the corporate communications group at Walmart, right? It was, and I was ticked. So I sat at my little computer and I wrote my own message to our students, and I sent it to Jeff, our communication, and he called me. He said, "Really?" He said, "Really? You really want to send this?" I said, "Send it." And 30 minutes later, I'm talking to a family member on the phone, who says to me, "What did you do? Like, what are you talking about?" And she said, "They're reading I'm watching Good Morning America right now, and they're reading your letter on Good Morning America." And you can still find that letter, by the way, if you Google it. It was, but the point is, beyond being a funny story, it made that was the best thing I could have done. Best thing I could have done, because it started. I realized that, people are scared. Like this isn't just some, little blip or controversy. People are scared, and they needed to hear from me. If I was the one that was going to be out in front of this, they needed to hear from me in my own voice, unfiltered, and often. And that started that one communication, because before that, I would have been content to let, my colleague, occasionally push out an update or something like that. But that one experience highlighted to me how important, because not only was I able to communicate to the students how problematic their behavior was, but it reassured everybody else on campus that somebody's got this, right? And that started, for almost the next 2 years. If you were here, you remember them. You got 2 emails a week or so from me. They called them Haynie-grams. And I sent them, even if I didn't have anything new to say. Like I would just come up with, because in a vacuum, people make up their own version of what's going on. So I would send these messages twice a week for 2 years, just letting people know what's going on relative to the pandemic on campus, and how the university is responding. And that is something. Get ready. You'll probably hear from me a lot moving forward too, because I think it's important.
Using 3 words to describe your messages, what would you describe them as? Your emails. While I search for one more.
I know that question is not. I have no idea. How about somebody else do it? Who remembers my messages? And who? Stern. Okay, Stern. I wouldn't have chosen that, but I would have chosen like empathetic and supportive.
See, these are the ones that I was asking you to say.
No. Okay.
I'll sum it up with the last question, and it's the one I'm most interested in, actually. But you spent almost 20 years building programs and partnerships here at Syracuse, but what are you most excited for what comes next?
I think it would be it's I alluded to all the change um, that is ahead. We this university is a remarkable, wonderful place, and as I said, for me, one of the responsibilities I'm going to take very seriously is preserving all the good that is here. But that will be hard. Um, as we deal with a dramatically declining number of 18-year-olds coming out of U.S. high schools, as we try to address what is, if you look at public trust in American institutions, it should be a wake up call to those of us who work in this space that over the past 5 years, no American institution has lost more trust of the public than U.S. higher ed over the last 5 years, and that's compared to Congress, banks. It's not the lowest, but in terms of decline over the past 5 years, it is the fastest declining. You have families questioning the value of a 4-year college degree. I think the last poll I saw, 63% of Americans did not believe that a 4-year college degree was worth it. That's unprecedented, right? All of that is in front of us as we try to think about how we respond to those challenges. The upside of that, what excites me, to your question, the upside of that is the opportunity for us. We should be excited about the opportunity to think differently about what we do, and bring to the academic enterprise and the student experience new and different opportunities to teach, to research, to create knowledge, to get students excited, and maybe prepare them differently. It's amazing that we got through this conversation without AI coming up, right?
Right.
But think about that. We have to prepare young people differently than we have in the past. We also have to create experiences for them while they're here that are aligned with what they're passionate about. It's the it's the reason it was in this room, in the fall, that we did the launch for the new Whitman Newhouse partnership around the creator economy. That's not because I love TikTok, though I have become a fan. It's a great way to kill time, but it's because this generation communicates differently. This generation consumes content differently, and as a consequence, we need to teach and train differently. So for me, the exciting thing about what's ahead is being innovative and entrepreneurial in terms of how we respond to the challenges coming at higher education. I think if we do that well, and we do that quickly, not with 9 task forces and 3 committees that study the problem over the next 4 years, because we don't have that kind of time. But if we do that well, we do that quickly, we can thrive relative to our peers, because I'm not convinced many of our peers will do that well or do that quickly, but we're all facing the same challenge.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
So hold on.
Yeah.
I get to ask you a question.
Okay.
Okay?
I'm ready.
So to wrap this up,
Yeah.
so tell everybody what you're going to do when you graduate from here.
Okay. Yeah. So graduation is on the 9th and 10th for me. I'm a part of the Hendricks Chapel Choir. So the day after graduation on the 11th, I'm going to South Africa on tour for 2 weeks, where we're going to be singing in Johannesburg, Cape Town, and a bunch of other locations with some of the local schools there. And then once I return, I get back May 24th. 2 weeks later, I start a full-time job at Travelers Insurance. We're going to be doing a 3.5-year rotational program. Every year you rotate to a different department of the business and potentially new locations. So I'll get a lot of opportunity trying new things, seeing what I like. And in your third rotation, you get to manage a team of actual employees, which is why I kind of asked about leading people that are a little bit older. But yeah, that's going to be kind of my path for the next maybe 3 or 4 years.
Okay, and best experience at Syracuse University over the last 4 years.
Ooh, that's hard. Although it's not at Syracuse here, I'd have to say my study abroad experience in Madrid. I think the study abroad program at SU is insanely good. I met so many people that I wouldn't have met because I'm not just in Whitman. I got to meet a lot of students in other places too. And just the opportunity to travel and see a lot of different things, cultures, try new foods. It was just like,
And you got to
experience.
sing over there too. What was
And-
the name of the group you started?
I started an a cappella group there called Acapaella. Yeah, it started as just a joke originally with some friends because I did the seminar program that happened 2 weeks before the actual semester started. And when we got there, they were like, I just talked about acapella because I was in an acapella group here on campus and I love to sing. I wanted to have an outlet there. So it started as a joke, and then I started getting a few people that were interested in actually doing it. And after that, there was a bunch of schools at Syracuse program. There was Duke, Kenyon, Colgate, Hamilton, and a lot of the people don't really know each other. So I made like an info session about joining acapella, and then we had 4 rehearsals during the semester. We had a performance at the end of it with like the entire faculty staff, like the homestay family that came to it. And we performed "I Want You Back" by the Jackson 5. And yeah, the whole time I'm a marketing major, but I never really got to do a lot of, I guess, creative things in my classes that were like on Instagram and stuff. So I made an Instagram page and we did like a lot of posts and stuff. So yeah, that was a really good
How I
experience.
found out about Acapella.
Yeah.
Yes.
Once you know about it, you can't forget about it.
Well, thank you, Marc.
Thank you.